Are Russian Germans considered Russians, Germans, or both? Several million Russian Germans live in Germany. Learn who they are, their history, and why they're here in this video. To explore Russian-German history, we must go back to the 15th century, spanning through the 18th century. The Russian Empire grows at an incredible speed, and all this new land can't be settled and cultivated as quickly as it grows. This is a thorn in the side of the ruling class in Russia, and above all, Catherine the Great recognizes this problem. The Russian Empress of German descent issues a manifesto allowing thousands of German farmers to move to Russia. She promised the German settlers free land, tax exemption, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, their own rights over the land, and they did not have to serve in the military. These benefits attracted many German farmers to Russia, because Russia had what the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation lacked: land and space. And on top of that, these advantages, for Russians, that was just a small part of their country. For Germans, it was as large as Belgium. In the first 3 years after the manifesto by Catherine the Great, more than 30,000 German farmers emigrated to Russia. That marked the start of Volga loyalty, as Catherine the Great brought Germans to the Volga region, especially near Saratov. Later, immigrants then found their new home in the Black Sea region, or around Kiev, or in Bessarabia. So those were the main areas where the Russian Germans then settled. Tragically, thousands of Russian Germans did not even survive the journey, and those who survived quickly realized that they were no longer the kind of immigrants the Tsars had previously brought into the country. Russian Germans, who arrived in smaller waves before Catherine the Great, had an excellent reputation. They were seen as reliable, loyal to the Tsar, and had a strong work ethic. So Germans in Russia were highly respected and had an excellent reputation. But this time, under Catherine the Great, it wasn't like that, because they were deliberately sent to these different regions, to the Volga region, to the Black Sea region, and they were no longer allowed to settle in the cities or practice their original professions, but had to work in agriculture. That means their freedom was already drastically restricted. Nevertheless, the German farmers built a new life for themselves. And over the next decades, more than 100 Protestant and Catholic communities emerged, in which only Germans gathered and lived together. People in Germany noticed this in the early 19th century. In the early 19th century, more than 50,000 Russian Germans came to Russia. And yes, the whole thing grew tremendously. At the start of World War I, high birth rates meant about 2.5 million Russian Germans lived in Russia. Roughly half are in St. Petersburg and Moscow, the rest in rural areas. As I said, in the Volga region, in the Black Sea region, so several million Germans, so to speak, in Russia at that time. So, to sum up, in the first centuries after their arrival, the Russian Germans already enjoyed privileges, and above all, they built a new life for themselves. But that was about to change drastically. Thus starts the tragic history of the Russian Germans, which I think many in Germany aren't even aware of. In 1871, with the founding of the German Empire, the assimilation law was introduced. There was fear that the Russian Germans would be influenced by the new sense of nationalism in Germany, so they wanted to Russify the Russian Germans more and more. That means the new official language, even for the Germans in the schools, was supposed to be Russian. They no longer had the right to dispose of their own land, no more right to self-administration. That means the privileges, I would say, slowly turned into discrimination in the first steps. Many Russian Germans saw this as a chance to integrate further, but many were also simply worried about the new hostility towards Germany that then existed in Russia. That's why, at that time, several 100,000 Russian Germans emigrated to South and North America. It was the first major wave of Russian-German emigration. At the beginning of World War I, things got really bad. Germans were deliberately discriminated against and harassed. They were now basically considered enemies, and the situation of the Russian Germans worsened. Still, many Russian Germans loyally fought for Russia despite discrimination. But on the other hand, there were the Germans who welcomed the Russian Germans with open arms again. That means a kind of conflict of conscience arose. You were no longer wanted by the Russian side, and the side you were fighting against, so to speak, wanted you. That was my first big moral conflict. When the German and Austro-Hungarian armies advanced further, even 300,000 Russian Germans were deported to Siberia under catastrophic living conditions. And German was banned in public for the first time. After Hitler took power in 1933, the situation got worse, and Germans were suspected even more of being spies. In Ukraine alone, 120,000 Germans were sentenced to death in 1937 and 1938. Minorities were often scapegoats. In Germany, it was Jews. In Russia, Germans. That means minorities had it very hard in many countries at that time. When Hitler then breaks the pact with Stalin and invades the Soviet Union, it really culminates in discrimination. Germans receive a passport stamp and are officially seen as second-class citizens, but Stalin aims to go further by erasing this minority's identity. He has German village names changed to Russian ones. He increasingly bans the German language again. In schools, only Russian is allowed, and they are forced into hard labor. Books and art are burned, and everything German is banned during this time. Many Russian Germans now view the Wehrmacht as liberators and flee westward. However, many other Russian Germans fail to do this and are deported to Siberia for logging, Tajikistan for cotton picking, or Kyrgyzstan to work in mines. Many had to keep doing forced labor, and Russian Germans' conditions only improved after Stalin died. And yes, around the 1950s, in 1955, many of these discriminations and disadvantages were removed as Germany regained stronger diplomatic ties. With Russia, in the 1960s, many Russian Germans still emigrated and returned to the Federal Republic, but many others stayed and simply wanted recognition that they had been wronged and treated criminally. However, this didn't occur, and Russian Germans remained discriminated against, and this led to the Russian Germans sticking together even more during this time, and the German culture being further strengthened. That means the customs, the traditions, the German language, they held on to all of these. And the communities, the villages, truly were more German than in decades prior. Unity was especially strong then. Gorbachev finally acknowledged the severe mistreatment of Russian Germans, and the Soviet Union collapsed during his leadership. During the 90s and 2000s, about 2 to 3 million Russian Germans returned to Germany. So an enormous number of Russian Germans returned to their original homeland. Exactly, and today several million Russian Germans still live in Germany. Most who stayed were not in Russia, but in Soviet Union successor states, be it in Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Armenia, or Ukraine. For instance, I have visited Kyrgyzstan, specifically the German village of Rotfront, and interviewed residents there. I'll show you a few clips of how I talked to the people. Or in Kazakhstan, I also found Germans who had returned to this village. That means the new home wasn't just Russia, but also Central Asia, the Eastern Bloc, and many were in the Baltics. Completely divided, that's where the current problem starts. While in the successor states of the Soviet Union, many Russian Germans are reproached for their German descent. In Germany, due to their accent or imperfect German, Russian Germans are not fully recognized as Germans, and they are classified as Russians. Even after returning to Germany, Russian Germans still face discrimination, but today they are well integrated. I also had many Russian German friends during my school years and met some Russian Germans during my studies, and I was always fascinated by their mentality and sense of family. Russian Germans still hold strong, deeply rooted values, and I can only confirm everything that the statistics say, so to speak. My message to viewers unfamiliar with Russian German history: Russian Germans are not Russians. An accent doesn't determine whether you're German or not. These people have fought for their culture for centuries, have stood up for the language, for the values, for the customs, for the traditions. Many might say Russian Germans are often more German than native Germans. Russian Germans returned under strict rules. They lived in apartments they couldn't leave, and family members could only join them under similar conditions. These people have put up with a lot so that they could give their children, the next generation, a better life. Russian Germans' degrees were often unrecognized. That means engineers, doctors, and mathematicians had to work in jobs for which they were overqualified. For example, in Russian supermarkets and so on, these people accepted that as well. The Russian Germans generally accepted everything without protest to give their children a better life, or even for themselves to start a new life. The second generation of Russian Germans no longer truly has a migration background. You can't tell these people have a migration background anymore. And you just have to say, I don't think there's any minority that in the second generation is already 100% so well integrated. So to sum up, that Russian Germans are not seen as Russians in Russia, that's something we can't change. We can change how Russian Germans are viewed as Germans in Germany. Here in Mannheim, the sun is setting. I've been standing here for a really long time now. Unraveling the Russian Germans' history here took time. It's partly a cruel story. I hope you were able to learn something new and also bring a bit of attention to this history. I would be glad if you started a discussion in the comments. Perhaps Russian Germans who watch my videos could share their experiences, such as what life was like when they arrived in Germany. Maybe also the people who are already in the second generation, what their feelings are. Corrections are welcome. If I was wrong, I'd be happy to learn more in the comments. But yes, I tried my best to summarize everything. Now the airplane is coming. So guys, let's keep the conversation going in the comments. And yes, we'll see each other again soon. Until then, bye.